Today I'm starting something I've wanted to do for quite a while. I'm going to run a series on building a complete platform game. What does complete mean? Well, it means we're going from nothing at all to some lovely squares moving around, and eventually to something that looks like this. Front-ended and back-ended, a functioning menu, screen shake, flourishes, and everything you need to build your own high-quality action platformer. A lot of this is content I've made before, reworked for GameMaker Studio 2, and brought together into one complete learning package for a beginner developer. So let's get started. So, humble beginnings. You've got a blank project in GameMaker Studio 2. What do we do now? Well, in order to actually get to our basic platforming game from nothing at all, we need to follow a few main steps. First thing we need to do is create what's called sprites for our player and our wall. Okay, those are the two game objects we're going to be working on in this part. So go ahead and right click in sprites and hit create. I'm going to call this S_player, S for sprite, player for player. I'm going to edit the image. You'll notice by default my sprites when I make a new sprite are 32 by 32. You can see width and height over here. Your default when you first start in GameMaker might be 64 by 64. That's fine, you can work with that as well. But if you want to change it, you can go to File, Preferences, and in there you'll find a setting to change your default sprite size. I'm going to work with 32 by 32. You can also resize it if you want to follow exactly along with what I'm doing. But that's the size I'm going to use. So now I've made the sprite, I'm going to go into edit image. I'm not going to spend long actually making an image. I'm literally just going to grab a nice green color and just fill the box. We're just going to have a fill green rectangle, and that's going to be our sprite. If I click this equals button here, you can see the exact size of the sprite. And that's really all I need. Make sure your origin as well. By default mine are also set to middle center. Yours might be set to top left by default. Make sure you select this little drop down box here and just select middle center, or you can type 16 by 16 into here. It's just important to have this little crosshair here that represents the origin or center of your sprite. Just make sure that is in the middle of your sprite, okay? Once I've done that, I'm going to do the exact same thing again. In fact, I'm going to right click S player, I'm going to hit duplicate. So I've got a second copy of this player sprite now. I'm making sure I'm editing the second one. I'm going to rename it to S_wall, and this is going to represent our wall. I'm going to quickly edit this to be just kind of a grey color or something for our wall objects that we're going to glide with. Again, make sure that origin is just lined up nicely in the middle there. So those are just a couple of images, okay? They don't do anything by themselves. I mean, we could have put anything in there as well. We could have added animation and so on, but we'll come to that stuff later. Those are just images. They don't do anything in our game. So in order to actually do stuff and have game logic, we need objects, okay? And they kind of represent the logical blueprints. They carry all of the game logic for our game. So we're going to make a couple of objects, one for the player and one for the wall. So right click in objects now and hit create. You'll see your workspace pans down here to give you a new object editor. I'm going to call this O player, okay? O meaning object, player being player. That's going to be our player object. In here where it says no sprite, you want to assign this to your player sprite, okay? Just click that, select your player sprite, okay? In events in here is where we're going to put all the game logic of the game, but before we actually do any of that, I'm first of all just going to create another object for our wall. I'm going to call that O wall. Set the sprite to be S_wall, okay, so that's our wall sprite. So now we have a couple of objects. Now before we actually set up any real game logic or anything like that and dive into the nitty gritty of developing a game, let's just go to our room, okay? So in rooms you'll notice you already have a room 0 that's been added by default. Every GameMaker game needs at least one room in order to run at all in the first place, so it gives you one by default. If we just double click that, it'll open up room editor. So you'll see you just have this big sort of black rectangle at the moment with kind of a grid, and in fact if you were to run the game right now, this is all you would see. You would just see a game window with a big black rectangle in it. There'd be nothing in it. You wouldn't see this grid either. That's just to help you place stuff in the room editor. You would just see this black rectangle. So we need to actually put stuff into our room, or into the game world if you will. So you can see we have kind of a couple of layers on the right here. We have background and instances. Make sure you've got the instances layer selected. Then just click in the resource tree on your player, and if you hold the Alt key, you'll see him appear under the cursor. Okay, that's me just holding the Alt key. You can also just drag, which I might just from the left like that, and place the player into the game world. Or, as I said, and now I'm going to select wall to start placing the walls around. If you hold Alt and see it appear under the cursor, you can then just click and drag to add multiple of an object into the game world. Some people who are maybe a bit more familiar with some of my older videos might be wondering why we're not doing a tile collision system, or we're going to use an object collision system, but we will come to tiles in maybe a later part. We're going to keep this real simple now, just for beginners, okay? So with just some walls there, just to kind of curve out a rough shape of a kind of a level for us to jump about in, that's really all we need. I'll just sort of delete these ones at the edge here, just selecting them and pressing delete on the keyboard. Just kind of clean it up a little bit. Just getting rid of some of the ones we don't really need. There we go, just nice sort of smooth layout there. So we have a room, we have our game object, and we have our walls. If I were to run the game now though, we've not really given this game any instructions to work with other than what should appear in the game room. So this is our game so far. It's just a little green square and grey rectangles everywhere. So what we actually need to do to get, you know, a video game out of this, or get something playable or interactive, is actually give the game instructions. We've not given it any instructions. We've just, other than you should place these objects around here in this room. Okay, that's all we've told it. So in order to give it more instructions than that, we're going to edit these game objects, OPlayer and, well, we're not really going to edit OWall much. OWall is just there to be a wall. But we're going to do a lot of editing to OPlayer. Okay, so double click on OPlayer just to bring you back to the workspace now. And I'm going to press F12 just to sort of, you know, maximize the workspace and give us some space to work with. You see we've got this window called events. Now what's an event? Well, the way GameMaker works is every object is based on events and actions. An event is when a certain thing in the game happens, say the user pressed a button, or a frame passed, or the object just got made or destroyed, or the room started or the game ended, or something like that. Those are what's called events, okay? And then they trigger certain actions to go off, which will appear over here. So I'm going to click Add Event, I'm going to add the Create event. Okay, so the Create event is triggered, it'll be triggered right at the start of the game when this object gets made in the room for the very first time by our game, okay? So what we're saying is when this object is created, do whatever code we write into this box, okay? Now, we're going to get started with some very, very, very basic code, okay? I'm going to declare a couple of variables, okay? So I'm just going to write a few things, and then I'm going to explain what they mean afterwards. I'm going to write HSP equals 0. With a semicolon on the end there as well. VSP equals 0. GRV equals 0.05. Actually, we'll make that 0.1. And walk SP equals 4. Okay, those are our 4 variables. You can see they've turned blue, the words on the left side of our equal sign, and the numbers on the right have turned red, okay? GameMaker kind of works out like what it is you're typing when you're writing code, and it marks certain elements appropriate colors. So what on earth am I doing here? Maybe I've just lost all of you, I've just written some nonsense. What does any of this mean? Well, a variable is just a word, any word we can make up. I can type in any number of characters like that, this or whatever, equals, and then say 50. Basically, all I'm saying is that this word, from now on, whenever I type it in the code, means this number. Okay, that's literally all a variable is. Okay, it's saying a word to equal something else. Usually a number, can be certain other things, but most of the time it can be another variable. So now that I've got HSP equals 0, so every time I type HSP, I'm basically telling the game 0, okay? What I can do later is say like HSP equals VSP, for example, and set one variable to equal whatever the result of another one is. And then basically how the bulk of programming works is we just comparing and changing what numbers are in these different variables in order to affect stuff in the game, okay? That's how we create game logic. We just compare and change numbers around until we get what we want, okay? So I'm just going to make this a bit bigger now, just so you can definitely always see whatever I'm typing on the screen here. So HSP equals 0. So what did all these words mean? These are all shorthand things. Like, what do any of these mean? HSP, I'm using a shorthand for horizontal speed. Okay, H for horizontal, SP for speed. You might guess VSP is vertical speed. Okay, GRV is going to be gravity, and walk SP is walk speed. So that's the speed we actually want to move when we move left and right, we're going to set our horizontal speed to be this number in whichever direction, okay? So the reason HSP and VSP are currently 0 is because we don't actually want to be moving at the start of the game. We want to set yourself to move based on whether you're pressing left and right or whether gravity is applying. Speaking of gravity, that's what GRV means. GRV stands for gravity, and I'm setting that to 0.1, meaning we're going to move downwards at like 0.1 pixels a frame every single frame while we're in the air, okay, until we touch the floor. So just copy those down if you're following along. Don't worry too much if I've already kind of lost you diving into this code. It'll all start to become clear as you do more of it. The more of this you write, the more of it you practice, the more it'll all start to slowly make sense, okay? Feel free to go back and rewatch if you don't understand any of the explanations I just made. The only other thing I'll clarify is that these semicolons on the end here, that just tells GameMaker when a line of code has finished, okay? Because you can technically do funny things where you carry on one line of code onto multiple lines, as weird as that sounds. But for now, all you need to remember is at the end of almost every line of code, you want to write a semicolon just to officially tell GameMaker where that line of code ends. GameMaker's actually very forgiving, lets you get away with actually not putting this most of the time, like that'll still work. But it's good practice just to make sure you have those on the end of every line, okay? So now we've done that, now we've established a few of these variables, what I'm going to do is add another event. I'm going to add what's called the step event. Come down here, pass creates the fourth one down, step, and then you've got three different kinds, step, begin step, and end step. Don't worry about those last two, just select step, okay? The step event is a special event that happens every single frame of your game. So if you play games and you know about frame rates and things, or even if you don't, games tend to run at either 30 or 60 frames per second, okay? That means like you're being, basically every game is just showing you a sequence of still images at a certain speed, and it's showing them fast enough to you that everything looks like it's moving, right? Each one of those images is called a frame. So at 60 frames a second, our step event is going to be logic that happens every single one of those, so 60 times every second. And this is where we put the majority of our players' game logic, okay? So every single frame we check to see whether or not the user is pressing left or right or pressing jump, and then react accordingly and do other stuff, okay? So that's the very first thing we're going to do, is we're going to check to see if the player is pressing left, right, or spacebar. We'll have that for jump, okay? So how do we do any of that? Well, I'm going to do the same thing I did in the create event by establishing some variables, but I'm going to do it a little bit differently. I'm going to write some stuff, and again, I'll explain what it all means afterwards. So I'm going to write key left equals keyboard check, open bracket, VK left. Okay, so what on earth does any of that mean? Well, as you can see, I've got this blue line of text again here, but this time we've got a yellow word on the right-hand side, okay? And this is what's called a function or a command, okay? What that is basically a special line of code that does a certain thing in your game or checks a certain thing. And in this case, keyboard check, what it does is it checks to see whether or not we're pressing whatever key we specify in this pair of brackets, okay? So we specify VK left, which I think stands for virtual keyboard left, okay? So that'll tell us whether or not we're pressing the left arrow key. And whether, if we are, then basically what this whole line will mean is 1, okay, the number 1. And if we're not pressing it, it'll be the number 0, okay? So just like binary, 0 for false, 1 for true. And that number is then going to get placed into key left. So then we can later check what is in key left to know whether or not we're pressing the left arrow key. And I'm going to do the same thing for some other keys. So I'm going to have key right equals keyboard check, open bracket, VK right, close bracket, semicolon. And then key jump, lastly keyboard check, and this time underscore press, VK space. So now why have I written underscore pressed here? Well, that's going to, basically we don't want to check every single frame whether or not we're holding jump, we want to check to see whether or not we pressed it on this frame, okay? So whether these just return 1 or 0 based on whether or not the key is held or not. This returns 1 or 0 depending on whether or not the key was pressed on that frame. So the very frame that you actually pressed it for the first time. After that, it'll just return 0 until you let go of the button and press it again. Okay, so now we know whether or not we're pressing left, right, or jump, right? So now we need to actually react accordingly. So I'm going to make another variable, this time using the var function. Okay, you can see that turns yellow as well because it's doing something special in GameMaker. What var does is it lets you establish one of these variables, one of these blue words, but it establishes them as kind of a yellowy tint word. And what it means when you establish using var is that that variable is temporary. Okay, so it only lasts for one frame, so one loop of this step event. That's as long as it lasts for. So the var is going to be called move. And now what I'm going to set this to equal is key right minus key left. Now think about what I just told you about these variables. Okay, so key right is going to be 1 or 0 depending on not we press the right arrow key, and key left is going to be 1 or 0 depending on whether or not we pressed the left arrow key. So if I subtract key left from key right, imagine you're pressing right but not left, so you'd get 1 minus 0 giving move 1. Now imagine you're pressing key left but not key right. You'd get 0 minus 1 minus 1. Okay, so you get 1 if you're moving right, minus 1 if you're moving left. The reason I'm doing it this way, it might seem a bit like anti-intuitive, but the reason I'm doing it like this is so that if you're pressing both keys, you get 1 minus 1, 0, so that you don't want to move at all when you're pressing both arrow keys, or when you're pressing neither, 0 minus 0 is 0. Okay, it just handles every possible outcome very, very elegantly. Okay, it's a very smooth way of dealing with whether or not you're pressing left and right, and whether or not you should move in that direction. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set our horizontal speed. So remember the variable that we wrote, HSP, we set it to 0 in our create event. In here, HSP equals 0. What we're going to do now is set that to equal move. So whatever that happens to be on this frame, it might be 0, 1, or minus 1, multiplied by walk sp. Okay, so walk SP, which is 4, that's our current walk speed, or however fast we want to move left or right. So we're going to get either 1, 0, or minus 1. So if we are holding the right arrow key, we'll get 1 times 4, so we'll get 4, meaning we want to move 4 pixels to the right. Or if we're holding the left, we'll get minus 1 times 4 minus 4. We want to move 4 pixels to the left. Or it'll be 0 times 4 if we're pressing both or neither, meaning we don't want to move at all. Okay, and HSP is going to get that final result, so it'll be 0, minus 4, or 4. And then all I'm going to do in order to, so we can actually see some of this working now, because we've done a lot of playing around with numbers and variables without really seeing any fun game stuff. So I'm going to set X, you see X turns green, because that's a built-in property of our object. There's a few of those, okay? There's things like sprite, index, and all sorts of different properties and things that you can actually physically change about the object. X represents its X coordinate in the room, okay, so that's our horizontal coordinate in the game room. Y represents our vertical coordinate, so if we change either of these to be something else, the object will physically move in our game world. So I'm going to set X to equal itself, so whatever our X coordinate currently is going to equal itself again, which obviously wouldn't change it, but we're going to add HSP, okay? So we're going to add either 4 or minus 4 to our current X coordinate to move us around. So we'll either move 4 pixels to the right or 4 pixels to the left. And now before I run the game, I'm going to quickly go into game options, okay? And just at the top here in main options general, I'm going to set game frames per second to 60, just so we get a nice smooth 60 FPS game. You can leave it at 30 if you prefer, but I prefer the game to run at a smooth 60. So I'm going to hit play now, or you can also press F5. And you see we've got our game again, just our green objects and our white squares around. But if I press the left and right arrow keys now, you see our green square actually starts to move around. Okay, So there's some obvious problems here. We've not quite got a platformer yet, okay? We can move left and right, but we can move through walls. That's no good. And we don't fall and we can't jump. Okay, that's because there's no gravity. And that's because there's also no collisions set up with any of the walls, okay? So that's what we're going to look to do next. Okay, so back in our player object, we now need to check to see if we're colliding. So how do we work out if there's a collision between the player and the wall? And then how do we react accordingly, right? What we're going to do, we're not actually going to check to see if we're like currently colliding with the wall, we're going to predict it. Okay, so here we've worked out with HSP where we're going to move. We're going to end up moving at X plus HSP. So what we're going to do before we commit to making this movement, just in the middle here, we're going to check to see if there is a collision. And if there is, we're going to reduce our speed and stop that problem before it actually happens. Before I do that, I'm going to add in a couple of quick comments in here, just so we can see what each section does. So by typing 2 forward slashes in a row, you can see the text turns green, and that means I can just write whatever I want, and it won't get computed as code. Just useful for writing notes and reminders. So this section here is get player input, I suppose. This section here would be calculate movement. We're going to do horizontal collision here, okay? Just useful so you can sort of tell what's going on. In fact, we're running out of space here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to press F12, just close this, maximize this, just so we've got as much space as possible here to work on our code. Okay, because this is basically all we need to work in now until the end of this particular part. So for horizontal collision, I'm going to type if place meeting, okay, open bracket X plus HSP, comma, Y, comma, O, wall, close bracket again. Then I'm going to go underneath and open a squiggly bracket and close a squiggly bracket. Now that was a lot of stuff, so what does any of that mean, right? If, as you can see, is a special thing quite like var. What if does is it asks GameMaker a question, okay? And that question is what we put in this pair of brackets. And it says, if the thing that's in the brackets is true, do whatever we put in these squiggly brackets. If this is not true, skip it and just go to whatever comes after it, okay? So if, and in place meeting, what place meeting does is check to see whether or not there is a collision between this object and the object that you give it here in the brackets at this position. Okay, so if my player happened to be in this spot, would there be a collision between my player and a wall? And if there is, it returns 1. If there isn't, it returns 0. If it returns 1, we do this stuff. If it isn't, we skip straight to movement. So is there a collision between myself and the wall? And if there is, what do we do about it? So if there is a collision, the first thing we want to do is set HSP to equal 0, right? We don't want to move anymore now that we know that there's going to be a collision if we were to actually move where the player was telling us to, okay? But that's not all we want to do, because if you think about it, if you were, say, 3 pixels away from the wall, and you wanted to move 4 pixels towards the wall, now the problem there is that you can set your speed to 0, but then you would still be 3 pixels away from the wall. So what you actually want to do is set your speed to 0, but then move as close as you can. So how do we work that out? Well, we're going to use what's called a while statement. So type while. Now while, for the most part, works exactly the same as if, okay? We're going to ask GameMaker a question in these brackets. If that question returns true, we're going to do whatever we put in these squiggly brackets, okay? So what's the question? We're going to ask to see if there's not a collision 1 pixel in the direction we're moving, okay? So you can see how we did if place meeting up here. That's to say if there is a collision. We want to see if there's not a collision. Now you can do that, you can change anything to a not instead of an is, just by putting an exclamation mark in front of it. So by typing exclamation mark, place meeting, we're going to check to see if there's not a collision, okay? It flips the result you get. So if I get a 1, it treats it as a 0. If we get a 0, it treats it as a 1, okay? just a quick way of doing that. So we're going to check if our x coordinate, but not plus our full horizontal speed, plus sine HSP, and then comma our y coordinate, and the object we're looking for is a wall again, okay? So if there's not a collision at x plus sine HSP, what's sine do though? That's another function. What does this do? Sine returns either 1 or minus 1, depending whether or not the variable we give it is positive or negative. Okay, so because HSP, like if we were moving to the right, HSP would be 4, so sine HSP would be 1. If we're moving left, it would be minus 4, so sine HSP would be minus 1. Okay? So if that happens to be true, then we do whatever's in these brackets. Now the difference between a while statement and an if statement is a while statement will continue to do these things over and over and over and over and over again. It'll just loop on the spot over and over until this condition is no longer true, okay? So as long as there's not a collision 1 pixel in the direction of movement, we continue doing what's in here over and over and over. We don't even finish a new frame until it's done. So you have to be very careful, otherwise you can cause freezes and infinite loops if you get stuck in a while statement. So you want to be careful how you use them and make sure the condition eventually returns false. So what do we want to do while there's no collision 1 pixel to the side of us? Well, we want to increase our x coordinate by 1 in that direction. So I'm going to say x equals x plus sine HSP. So we're going to increase x by 1 in either to the right if it's plus 1 or to the left if it's negative 1, okay? That there should really be enough. If I press F5 now and run the game, you should see if I move to the left, I can't go through the wall anymore. I collide flush against the wall, nice and cleanly. And if I move all the way to the right, again, flush against that wall, perfect pixel collision, okay? So now there's obviously a problem in that game. We don't have any gravity still, and we still can't jump or anything like that. So let's fix that, okay? Let's move these things close together, because this is a horizontal section, okay? Let's create a collision section for vertical movement, okay? I'm just going to copy and paste that whole section, because what we're going to do is completely the same thing, okay? So I'm going to change this to vertical, and now we just need to move these plus HSPs to the Y coordinate and change them from HSP to VSP for vertical speed, right? And then we want to change these X's to Y's. So make sure you do all of those steps, okay? If you're following along, make sure you copy it down. I'll just do it first, and then you can make sure you've got it exactly right, okay? So I'm going to cut, just with Control X, this section in front of X here, paste it in front of Y instead. I'm going to do the same here, this plus sine HSP, cut that, paste it in front of Y instead, okay? Just those two sections. Then I'm going to rename HSP to VSP instead, okay? Then I'm also going to change this one to VSP, this one to VSP, and this one to VSP, okay? So you should have no HSPs left in this section. They should every single one of these blue things should read VSP, okay? Make sure. I'm going to change these X coordinates here to Y's. Oh. Okay, so those should be Y's. I want to leave these X's in, but change all the rest of those other 4 here, just these 4, to Y's, okay? And then that should be it, okay? That's everything we needed to actually change there. That's vertical collision done. Okay, we just copy paste that, change some variables around. It's exactly the same thing, just in the other direction with the other coordinate. We won't notice it yet because we don't actually have any vertical movement, so let's fix that. We want to move by our gravity, okay? So let's say VSP equals VSP plus GRV. Remember, that's the gravity variable we set up in the create event. It's 0.1. Let's change it up to 0.3. Make it a little bit quicker, okay? Once you've done that, come back to the step event. So that should be enough to actually make us move by gravity. So if I run the game now, I just pressed F5 there, it'll compile a bit at the bottom. And then you can see right at the start there, I just fell down. And I can demonstrate again just by walking off this ledge. Just watch very carefully. I fall, okay? And I land flush against the surface, and as you can see, I'm still colliding perfectly. So we're almost there now. We almost have what's recognizable as a platformer, right? So if I close that, the last thing we need to do is make it so you can actually jump. So jumping, how on earth do we do that? Right, so what we first need to do is check if we're on the floor. Okay, we obviously don't want to be able to jump over in the air, or maybe we do, in which case ignore this next line of code, which is going to be if place meeting, again, just another collision check, x, our current x coordinate, y plus 1, so 1 pixel below us. Remember, vertical movement is positive if we're moving down, or it's negative if we're moving up. And O wall for the wall object. Close both pairs of brackets and open squiggly bracket and close it again. So if we're on the floor, okay, so if we're on the floor, we also then want to check to see if the jump key is being pressed. Now I could type if key jump here and open another if statement, but we don't need to do that. What we can do is combine our current if statement with another one. So if I type 2 ampersand symbols here, or I just write the word and, but I'm going to use the ampersand symbols. Both do the same thing. That means we're going to check 2 conditions. So we're going to check to see if this is true and whatever we put here is true, okay? And we'll only do what's in the squiggly brackets if they're both true, okay? So and key jump. Okay. Oh, don't need that other one. There we go. So we've got 2 conditions there if we're on the floor and we've just pressed jump. So what do we want to happen? Well, we want to change our vertical speed. So we take VSP equals -7. Okay, I'm just going to say, because we're going to move upwards, we want to move upwards by quite a lot, so I'm just going to use a big negative number, -7, to allow us to jump. So now if I press F5, you can see we're on the floor there, and we fall to the floor, and if I press space, we actually jump, and then gravity brings us back down. So there you have it, that's the basics. That's setting up a very simple platform game. That's a lot of, if you're very new to programming, that's quite a lot to get your head around at first. So if you didn't understand any of this code at all, first of all, I'd recommend just, typing it all in exactly as you've seen here, exactly as I described it. And then what you can actually do is you can middle click on any of these functions, and they'll actually take you to the manual. Okay, the manual will open at the page for that function, and it'll tell you what it does. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll catch you guys next time. Thanks for watching. A huge shout out to my Patreon supporters, without whom none of these videos could realistically happen. A big shout out in particular to Dan, Angel Rodriguez, Harold Guidry, and Jason McMillan. Thank you guys ever so much, and thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, maybe subscribe, or maybe pledge $1 or $2 a month on Patreon. Up to you, do what you like, but I would totally appreciate it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. See you guys.